You are 16, cloaked in white silk, your feet bare, your lips trembling. Behind you, a dozen eyes watch, ahead, a bed freshly made, bloodless, waiting. You were told this day would make you a queen, but no one told you about the linen. No one warned you that tonight, your purity must bleed before witnesses, that if the sheet stays clean, you die. That they will search your body, your soul, your secrets until something breaks, and it will not be the system. The room is quiet, but not empty. You feel them, the eyes behind the curtain, behind the stone, behind the veil of protocol. You are not alone tonight. You are the bride, the offering, the proof. And the bed behind you is not for love. It is for evidence. In some royal courts, they called it the bridal witness. A single white linen sheet, laid under the new queen and her groom, expected to emerge with a stain of blood by morning, as a symbol of purity surrendered, of honor intact. But this ritual was not private. Maids would wait outside the door. Court ladies would collect the sheet. In some palaces, it was paraded in front of guests at breakfast. In others, it was shown to the bride's father, like a receipt for a transaction complete. If there was no blood, there were consequences. You were told virginity meant virtue, but no one told you what happened if your body didn't bleed. No one explained that many women don't. That trauma, illness, even riding horses could break the hymen long before marriage. That not everybody obeys a myth, but kings and priests didn't care. In 18th century Russia, when a young princess married into the imperial family, her sheet was taken straight to the empress, and her life hung on its markings. In medieval France, beds were inspected by servants after the wedding night, with a court priest present to bless or condemn the scene. Some queens faked the stain with drops of animal blood. Others used sponges soaked in red wine, and a few, terrified of exposure, cut themselves discreetly before the act, just to be safe. One royal bride was found in tears the morning after, with no mark on the linen and no voice to defend herself. She was sent back to her father's castle in disgrace, untouched, unloved, and forever whispered about. Another wasn't so lucky. Her groom cried fraud. She was accused of lying, her marriage annulled, and days later her body was pulled from a well. Her crime wasn't infidelity. It was not bleeding on command. The most terrifying part was not the bed itself. It was the silence that followed. The door would close, the couple left alone, and yet every heartbeat echoed beyond the chamber walls. Royal servants weren't just maids. They were witnesses, spies, and messengers of shame. In some courts, the sheets weren't collected, they were inspected, smelled, held to candlelight by suspicious fingers trained to spot deceit. If blood was absent, rumors would spread faster than ink. Ministers would whisper. A mother-in-law might begin plotting annulment before breakfast. In Spain, a young noblewoman accused of deceiving her royal husband was stripped of her dowry and sent to a convent, even though later her physician confirmed she had simply been too nervous to bleed. But no one listened to science when the patriarchy demanded spectacle. Sometimes the sheet was just the beginning. In 17th century Persia, brides whose virginity was uncertain were taken aside after the wedding night and examined again, this time by a midwife, and to elder women, the girl would be placed on a cloth mat, legs parted, and judged in silence. Her cries didn't matter. Only their verdict did, and if the news was bad, her fate was sealed. In one documented case, a concubine in the Ottoman court failed to produce a stain after her first night with the prince. She swore her innocence, begged the chief eunuch to believe her, but he had seen this before. The girl disappeared by morning, her name, like her body, erased from the palace records. To avoid such endings, some women staged their own miracles. A French duchess once instructed her lady-in-waiting to slit the leg of a chicken and press it under the covers at dawn. Another queen, terrified by a prophecy, used red berries to stain her palms and smeared them across the sheets as the servants approached. But the lie only worked once, because the next bride, the one who couldn't fake it, bore the full weight of centuries of suspicion. And when the linen stayed white, it wasn't just her wedding that ended. It was her freedom. But what if the linen bore blood, and still, they didn't believe you? Some brides bled naturally, but not enough. Others bled, but the court claimed it was too red, too watery, too thin to be trusted. The rituals were never about biology. They were about control. In 18th century Bavaria, one princess was married at 15 to a powerful duke who demanded the bloody sheet be presented to his council. When it was, he accused her of foul play, claiming the stain came from a servant's trick. The girl sobbed and begged for mercy, but was locked in a tower for 6 months until a second inspection could be arranged. That time, she fainted before her body could be touched. The marriage was dissolved. She lived out her days in a convent. Her name whispered behind veils, her only crime, not bleeding the right way at the right time. Some royal families, paranoid about succession, kept the used linens in archives, rolled, labeled, and sealed in wax. Like trophies of virtue, in certain Italian courts, the bloody sheet became part of the dowry inventory, passed between families like a relic. For the men, it was proof. For the women, it was trauma wrapped in linen. And what no one ever said aloud was this: some sheets were stained with more than blood. There were nights when brides were too young, too scared, or too forced, when consent was not given but assumed, and when screams were muffled by the weight of royal expectation. Eventually, the ritual faded, science caught up, laws changed, but the fear never truly left. Even centuries later, women descended from noble lines still whispered stories of mothers who bled for honor, of sisters who died from shame, of a sheet that decided whether you were wife or witch. And beneath the gold and silk, that single thread remained, the belief that a woman's worth could be reduced to a stain, not her voice, not her soul, just proof, uncottoned, before witnesses, while history watched and remembered nothing but the color red. They called it medicine, but you knew what it was: humiliation disguised as science. Before you could be married, crowned, or touched by royalty, you were ordered to undress, not for your future husband, but for strangers, midwives, matrons. Sometimes men, their hands were cold, their faces emotionless. You were a royal bride, promised to a foreign crown, and yet, here you stood, naked, inspected like livestock before purchase. In the glittering courts of 18th century Austria, virginity was a national matter. Empress Maria Theresa, obsessed with purity and succession, ordered her daughters examined before they could be married into Europe's most powerful houses. The tests were recorded, signed by physicians, and sent across borders with the dowry. A clean bill of chastity was worth more than gold. In Russia, the Tsar's medical council required formal certificates of intactness before any dynastic union. A team of midwives would gather in silence. The girl, often trembling and barely 16, was made to lie on a wooden table lined with white cloth. She wasn't allowed to speak. Her governess stood nearby, looking away. The examiners whispered terms in Latin as they prodded, measured, confirmed. Some called it routine, others, behind closed doors, called it cruel, because the truth was simple. If a royal woman failed the exam, the marriage would be called off, and she would carry the shame, not the man, even if she had done nothing, even if her body simply didn't appear the way they expected. Sometimes, the exam was faked. In one German principality, a princess known for riding horses and climbing trees had torn her hymen years before marriage. Her governess bribed the court doctor to declare her untouched, forging the certificate that secured her royal match. But she never forgot the table, the silence, the hands. In her diaries, she called it her first death, because even though she survived the ritual, something in her dignity did not. She learned then what every royal woman eventually did, that before you could be loved, you had to be proven, and that proof had nothing to do with you. Some examinations were quiet, clinical, others were public theater. In early modern France, certain royal betrothals required the bride to undergo a virginal review before members of the court, not fully exposed, but close, a performance. Masked as medical necessity, curtains were drawn, women gathered, and the girl was presented like a sacrificial lamb. If she cried, They called it guilt if she didn't. They called it pride. No reaction was ever correct. One account from 1725 tells of a noble bride who fainted before the exam could begin. She was declared unfit for marriage and replaced within weeks, her name scratched from every document, her body locked away in a convent for the rest of her life. Her only sin, fear. But some stories turned even darker. In the Ottoman court, concubines destined for the Sultan's bed were sorted, ranked, and examined not just for beauty but for supposed purity. Eunuchs, men surgically altered and stripped of desire, were assigned to supervise these rituals, believing they posed no threat, but the women knew otherwise. The power imbalance remained. One concubine, taken from Greece at age 14, was said to have wept through her entire inspection, whispering prayers in her native tongue. Her hymen was declared uncertain. She was rejected. Within days, she disappeared. Some said she was sold back into the slave markets. Others said she drowned herself in the palace cistern. Her name was never recorded, only her defect. The idea behind these inspections was not safety, it was ownership. These weren't health checks, they were property appraisals. The body of a royal woman was not hers to protect, it was her family's investment, her country's asset, her husband's prize. And so, the examiners kept working, decade after decade, poking, peering, documenting what they thought made a woman whole, never asking what it cost, never wondering what it meant to touch a girl's body while stripping her of every part of herself that mattered, dignity, voice, choice, all written off in the name of proof. Sometimes, the test wasn't just physical, it was psychological. A queen in waiting might pass the examination and still be haunted by it for the rest of her life. In letters, journals, and confessions hidden in monastery walls, royal women described the aftermath not in medical terms, but in the language of violation. One archduchess wrote that after her exam, "I no longer walked like myself. I walked like someone who had been entered without being touched." Another said she wept each night for a year, not because of her husband, but because of the memory of the 3 midwives who told her to open like a book and speak no words. Some of these women fought back, but subtly. A Persian princess once requested that her examination be conducted behind 2 curtains, one for modesty, the other to prevent her face from being seen. She spoke only through her handmaid and refused to respond to the examiners directly. It was a silent protest, but it worked. The test continued, but her dignity remained intact, if only for a moment. Others weren't as lucky. In 19th century India, British colonial officials demanded virginity verifications for girls entering royal harems they now controlled. These weren't just about culture, they were about power, and behind every so-called test was a larger message. Your body is not your own. It belongs to empire, to bloodline, to politics. And yet, through all the centuries, not a single one of these so-called experts could actually prove what they claimed. Virginity, as they defined it, was a myth dressed in science, a fragile tissue, used as a leash, an excuse for control. Some midwives even admitted it quietly, that the hymen could break from a fall, or never bleed at all, but the truth didn't matter. What mattered was that the woman submitted, that she didn't question, that she stayed silent, even as her body became evidence, because in the eyes of history, her value was never in her voice, it was in her inspection. Before they tested your body, they tested your life. In royal courts across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, virginity wasn't just a physical state, it was a performance, and that performance began long before your wedding night. From the moment you were promised to a king, a prince, or a throne, your every move became a matter of state. You were watched not just by governesses, but by spies posing as servants, handmaidens trained to report whispers, and guards stationed outside your chamber not to protect you, but to observe. Some royal daughters weren't even allowed to walk alone past sunset. If you spent too long speaking to a male servant, it was written down. If a gardener caught you laughing too freely, it was noted. The goal was not purity, it was control. And control began with fear. In 18th century Spain, The infanta was kept in a wing of the palace where male entry was forbidden. Not even her own father was permitted without a lady of the bedchamber present. Her letters were read before they left the room. Her food was tasted, her gown stitched to her skin to prevent them from being removed by anyone but her trusted maid. She was royal, but she wasn't free. In the Habsburg courts, entire networks of noble women existed solely to chaperone the daughters of emperors, every bath supervised, every door locked from the outside at night. Some queens later wrote that they never learned what intimacy meant, because even in childhood, their bodies were treated as future property, something to guard, seal, preserve, like a precious artifact. But the most tragic stories came not from rebellion, but from rumor. A single accusation could unravel a dynasty. In Russia, a young noblewoman was falsely accused of sharing a letter with a stable boy. She was never given a chance to explain. Her marriage was cancelled, her dowry revoked, her brother lost his military post. She was sent to a remote convent, where she lived another 30 years without ever seeing a man again. Her virginity remained intact, her life destroyed. Some queens were born into their cages, others were married into them. In the Mughal Empire, princesses of royal blood lived in zananas, opulent yet suffocating enclosures, guarded by eunuchs and elderly women, where no man except the emperor could enter. The walls were marble, the air perfumed, the gowns stitched in gold, but beneath the silk, they were prisoners. Their letters passed through 10 hands before reaching the outside world. If they whispered too loud, the walls heard. If they dreamt of love, they learned to forget, and still, they were expected to remain pure, not just in body, but in thought. One Mughal princess was said to have carved poetry into her bedroom walls just to speak freely. The verses were later scrubbed away by palace attendants, she was told. Purity begins with silence. In Georgian England, royal daughters were not locked in towers, but they were locked in routine, rising at dawn, supervised meals, etiquette, drills, embroidery for hours, and always the presence of a lady-in-waiting just close enough to hear every breath. A princess who showed too much emotion in a letter might have her correspondence intercepted and burned. A girl who asked too many questions about marriage was considered excitable and sent to bed early. Even the act of menstruating was reported in some courts. The arrival of blood seen as a political milestone. It meant you were ready, and if you were ready, then men began to watch more closely, not openly, but you could feel it, the tightening of glances, the way your father avoided meeting your eye, the way old advisors whispered when you walked past. One royal bride later wrote in her memoir, "I was the most untouched girl in the world, and yet I had never felt more invaded, because that's what surveillance did. It hollowed you out. They didn't need to touch you to own you. They just needed to know everything, every step, every sigh, every possible impurity, not because they feared corruption, but because your body was a symbol, and symbols had to be spotless, no matter how much it cost to clean them." But there were palaces where the surveillance crept beyond the visible, where virginity wasn't merely protected, it was obsessed over. In some courts of Renaissance Italy, noble girls were never left alone, not even while bathing. A servant would stand beside the tub with eyes lowered, ears open, instructed to listen for anything, a whisper, a sigh, a name. When those girls went to bed, their doors were locked from the outside. Some beds were designed with hinges that creaked loudly when moved, so that pleasure itself would betray them. In extreme cases, fathers had mirrors placed in dressing chambers angled toward hidden peepholes. Better 1,000 locks, one duke once wrote, than a single dishonor. But what he meant was, better no daughter at all than a ruined one. These were the places where silence was a form of survival, where you learned to fold your thoughts like linens, to erase your desires before they could take shape. You learned how to walk without swaying your hips, how to smile without showing too much tooth, how to write letters with no secrets and cry without sound. And still, the fear remained that someone, somewhere, would think you impure, because even a suspicion could be fatal. In the 19th century Polish-Lithuanian court, A princess was accused of speaking too fondly of a young violinist. He had never touched her, but she blushed once when he passed. That was enough. The musician was flogged. She was sent away to marry an aging prince 3 times her age. Years later, she confessed she could no longer remember the violinist's name, only the way it felt to be watched. Virginity, in these courts, was never yours to guard. It belonged to the watchers. The moment you were born royal and female, your body became a question everyone felt entitled to answer, whether through maids, walls, letters, or locked doors. The world kept asking, is she pure? And no matter how fiercely you tried to remain untouched, the question itself left its mark, because when your virtue is public property, there is no way to remain whole. Not every royal woman surrendered quietly. Some didn't bleed and lied. Some bled and lied louder, because once they understood the rules, a few dared to twist them. In a small duchy near present-day Austria, a teenage bride was told on her wedding day that the bloody sheet must be presented to her husband's council. She nodded, said nothing, and later that night, before her new husband entered the room, she slit her own fingertip and pressed it into the linen. Was enough. The next morning, the maid lifted the cloth, nodded in approval, and the court rejoiced. The marriage stood. Years later, when her granddaughter asked about the wedding, the old woman only smiled and said, "What they wanted was red. I gave them red." These were the quiet rebels, the ones who learned to bend the ritual without breaking themselves. In France, a duchess once faked her wedding night entirely. Her husband, sick with fever and too weak to consummate the marriage, told her to wait, but the pressure was mounting, the dowry, the politics, the gossip, so she and her lady-in-waiting dipped a handkerchief in rabbit blood and laid it carefully on the marriage bed. The next morning, it was paraded through the castle with pride. No one ever knew. Or maybe they did, and chose not to question, because in royal courts, appearances were more sacred than truth. Then there were those who refused altogether. In 18th century Persia, a princess famously declined the virginity exam demanded before her arranged marriage. She stood before the court, eyes blazing, and said, "If he cannot believe me, he does not deserve me." The marriage was cancelled. Her father was humiliated, but the princess, shockingly, was not punished. Instead, she remained unmarried, ruling her province with quiet dignity for nearly 3 decades. Her story became legend. Girls whispered her name under their breath like a prayer, and for a moment, the system blinked, because one woman, standing still, had dared to say no. But rebellion didn't always look like defiance. Sometimes it looked like theater. In a Sicilian court, a young queen discovered that her sheets would be inspected the morning after her wedding by 2 elderly noble women loyal to her mother-in-law. She said nothing, and instead bribed her chambermaid to plant a rabbit's heart beneath the bed. That night, she told her husband to lie still. In the morning, the heart was crushed under the linen, blood blooming just enough to please the witnesses. The women left satisfied. The queen remained untouched, and in her diary, she wrote, "They wanted proof. I gave them performance. Others fought back through silence, dangerous, deliberate silence." In a Turkish palace, a concubine named Sophie was accused of having known a court musician before her arrival at the harem. Her virginity test was inconclusive, and the eunuchs prepared to dispose of her. But she didn't beg, she didn't cry, she simply stared. Days passed, no stain, no words, no confession, and somehow, the mystery saved her. The Sultan, intrigued by her defiance, called her to his chamber and kept her. She later became his consort, the most powerful woman in his court. Her silence had been her sword. Even the illusion of defiance could fracture the ritual. In Victorian England, a noblewoman was expected to undergo a medical exam before marrying a baron twice her age. She agreed, on one condition, that the examiner be female, and that her fiancé undergo a full physical inspection too. The baron laughed, the court gasped, the exam was cancelled, and the marriage, miraculously, still happened behind closed doors. Servants, whispered that it was the first time a man had been asked to prove what he demanded of a woman. The scandal faded, but the echo remained. Sometimes it didn't take blood to disrupt the ritual. Sometimes all it took was a question, aimed the other way. And then there were the stories that ended not in trickery, but in sacrifice. One queen, remembered only as Isolde of the North, was accused of deception on her wedding night. No blood on the linen, no witnesses to defend her, her husband. A cold man with cold advisers demanded she be punished for dishonoring the crown, but before judgment could fall, she stepped forward, placed her own dagger on the table, and said, "You may cut me open if you wish, but I will not bleed for your comfort." No one moved, no one spoke. The king stared at her, and after a long silence, he walked away. The marriage endured. The test was never brought up again. She had beaten the system not with lies, but with her body unbroken, unbent, unafraid. Others were not so lucky. A concubine in the Chinese imperial court, barely 15, passed her virginity exam, only to reveal days later that she had been assaulted by a eunuch during transit. When the emperor found out, she was blamed. They said she should have spoken sooner. She was sent to a cold hall in the outer palace, and forbidden from speaking ever again. She died within the year. Her rebellion had not been silent or clever, it had been honest, and that was unforgivable. Yet even these tragic endings cracked the walls, because for every woman punished, another remembered. Whispers turned to warnings, warnings became stories, stories became small rebellions, handkerchiefs soaked in beetroot, sisters who staged their stains, mothers who taught their daughters how to pass undetected. One day, the sheets stopped being inspected. The doctors stopped writing certificates. The eyes behind the curtains grew old and tired, and though the system never truly apologized, it began to shift because women learned how to bleed on their own terms, not for fathers, not for kings, not for courts that weighed their worth in cotton and shame, but for themselves. And in that quiet, painful resistance, something holy remained intact, not the myth of virginity, but the truth of survival. You are 16 again. The silk still clings to your skin, the bed waits behind you, but this time, you do not walk toward it. You look at the linen and realize it was never about you, not your blood, not your innocence. It was about the performance, about control, about history needing a spectacle to believe a woman was worthy. But what if you didn't give it to them? What if you simply walked away? For centuries, royal women were stripped, inspected, and paraded, their bodies treated as battlegrounds for power and myth. They were told their worth lived between their legs, in a stain no bigger than a coin. And yet, they endured. Some tricked the system, some bowed their heads, some bled, some refused, but all of them, in silence or in defiance, carved a crack in the ritual that once seemed unbreakable. We don't remember their faces, their names are scattered through footnotes and rumors, but we remember the stories, the false linens, the trembling hands, the quiet girls who whispered no, because through them we inherit not just tragedy, but rebellion, a soft, stubborn rebellion that asks one final question. What would it look like if a woman never had to prove her body was clean in order to be believed? If this story moved you, consider subscribing to this channel. We explore the darkest corners of royal history, not just to shock, but to understand, to remember the women history tried to silence. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these stories stayed with you the most, and why? If you were in their place, what would you have done? And until next time, remember, behind every crown lies a cost, and behind every ritual, a woman who dared to survive it.